I've been working on a history of potatoes and their connection to modernity. And this entire project has been viewed with what probably could be best described as, I don't know, bemusement by family, by friends, and to some extent by fellow historians who often wondered what there is to say about the connections between potatoes and modernity. I mean, what is there to say about potatoes at all, really? Lots of people have asked me. And I think it's clear that the forces that have created the modern world, like capitalism or colonialism or industrialization, etc., these are of obvious historical importance. But the potato, I think, seems very disconnected from any of those things, because if a potato represents anything at all to us, it's total ordinariness. I think a potato is a byword for the ordinary. It has nothing to do with events that are world shaping. And so what I want to do in this talk is to say a little bit about why potatoes can be part of the history of modernity and what they might tell us perhaps about modernity as well. But I want to start with a little bit of an overview of how historians have typically written about potatoes. So I want to give you a little sketch of the sorts of things that people say. So I'm going to start by telling you the standard story about the potato's spread from its home in the Andes to first early modern Europe and then to the rest of the world. So this story goes something like this. So the story is that although potatoes were a staple food for the people who lived up and down the South American Andes Mountains for millennia, and which had sustained them along with a variety of other foodstuffs, they were completely unknown to the rest of the world. And they arrived, which is absolutely true. Maybe I have a little slide. Oh, I've missed already many slides. A participant has enabled closed captioning, but they don't seem to have enabled my slide to move forward. Let's see. Let's try that next. There we are. Look, there are some of the things I wrote. But here I have what I wanted to show you was, sorry.
If I get rid of this.
Yes, that would.
Message.
Let's see, maybe I should be able to do. There we are. Look at that. Excellent. Can we get rid of the apps on the side? Will that go away? Oops, the duck.
Oops.
Thank you very much. Look, there's a picture of potatoes in their homeland. So back to my standard story about, sorry about that, about the history of the potato. So they arrived in Europe as a result of the European invasion of the Inca Empire in the 16th century. And so goes the story. On European soil, the potato, far from being a staple, was a total oddity. And scholars have adduced a whole series of reasons for why the potato was viewed with suspicion by early modern Europeans. One of the, and again, it doesn't, I don't usually have problems with PowerPoint. I'm sorry. Come on.
I'm trying.
Which
So I'm clicking out.
Are you left clicking to go forward?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. There we are. Here's an example of, if you know anything about potatoes, you might have encountered Radcliffe Salomon's classic, The History and Social Influence of the Potato. So many scholars, Salomon in particular, but many others, adduced a whole series of reasons for why early modern Europeans were suspicious of potatoes and supposedly declined to eat them until they were compelled to do so by hunger and famine and the clever publicity campaigns that enlightened monarchs such as Frederick the Great unleashed in the 18th century, at which point peasants abandoned their resistance to this unfamiliar food, and potatoes moved from being an oddity to being the staple that they have become today. So that's one sort of history of the potato that have been around for many, many decades. So there's a further strand to this standard history of the potato, and that deals with the potato's spread to the rest of the world. So we've got the story of their eventual triumph in early modern Europe, thanks to the combined forces of hunger and persuasion from elites. But there's also a story about how they traveled globally. So a number of scholars, starting, thank you, Mardo, for the left click, with yeah. Well, they're quite right to do so. Starting actually with Bertolt Laufer, writing in the 1930s, examined the potato's penetration into diets outside of Europe. And these works show that the potato reached China, for example, in the 17th century. There you can see an 19th century drawing of a potato plant from a Chinese botanical treatise, a potato market in India, that they reached India, well, actually in the 18th century and became widely consumed in the 19th century. And so we have a history that charts the potato's spread around the rest of the world. And unlike the history of the potato's entry into early modern Europe, these works do not, in general, present the potato as a conundrum to farmers and eaters in India or in China or in any other part of the world. So its unfamiliarity was apparently not an obstacle to its assimilation outside of Europe, in contrast to the supposed situation obtaining in early modern Europe. So that's a second body of scholarship. There's a third body of scholarship about the potato's global history. And these works are concerned with population growth in the years after 1500. And a number of historians and economists and other scholars have argued that the steady growth in Europe's population and also globally after about 1500 was due to better nutrition in a substantial degree. There's a considerable body of scholarship about this, and a number of scholars have picked out in particular foods from the Americas, and among them in particular the potato, as key to this improved nutrition which allowed for greater fertility, the longer survival of children, increased life expectancy in general. And so there's a particular body of scholarship. Here are some examples of such works which try to argue that the potato was particularly important to this process. And the article at the bottom, the one by Nunn and Keon, a pair of economists, in fact, attribute an astonishing 25% of world population growth since 1500 to the potato. So that's another body of scholarship. That's part of the way in which people have written about the potato so far. And these scholars they're certainly not wrong to identify the potato as a nutritional powerhouse. And the FAO and a whole series of other organizations now who are concerned with food security routinely laud the potato for its productivity, its calorific yield, its miserly use of water, its high nutritional content in terms of vitamins. I mean, there's a whole list of things I could say about why potatoes are superior to almost any other starchy foodstuff that you could wish to eat. And so there's something going for this kind of scholarship, whether one wants to really attribute 25% of world population growth to the potato or not. But at the same time, I think you can see that there are some very evident inconsistencies between these three bodies of scholarship. I mean, if Europeans declined to eat potatoes until the 18th century, it's hard to see how potatoes could be responsible for European population growth after 1500, right? Maybe I even put in a little slide there. We have some population growth. How could this be due to the potato? I mean, maybe we could say, okay, there's a real takeoff at the moment that potatoes were being eaten, but maybe there's some problem with trying to pin this on the potato, and globally as well. If potatoes were becoming common foods in places like India, really in the 19th century, again, can we attribute global population growth to the spread of the potato? And it's also not at all clear why European peasants were squeamish about an unfamiliar tuber, whereas peasant farmers in other parts of the world were not. So we have a number of potato histories, all of which expand our knowledge of global foodways in one way or another, but they're not wholly consistent, nor, it turns out, entirely correct. And so one of the things that I spent a good bit of time doing on this larger potato project was trying to find evidence that the potatoes spread across early modern Europe much earlier than had been claimed, and that, in particular, the protagonists of the potatoes' early modern spread were none other than the supposedly squeamish peasants who were refusing to eat potatoes until Frederick the Great coaxed them to do so. And I satisfied myself to this effect, and possibly some of the readers of the stuff I've written about this, that this was the case. But that's actually not the story I want to be telling here. The story I want to talk about here has to do with this link to modernity and the connections between potatoes and modernity, which I've already touched on a little bit in this body. Oh, hang on, I'm going forward. I want to go back. Well, will it ever happen? Can I go back? Let's see if I can go back. Let's see if I can go back again. No, who knows what I'm doing here? Is it possible to return this? I'm astonished by my. Also, the back key does work. Thank you. Yeah, there we are. If we look at this, if we think about population growth, I think this might take us back to thinking about questions of modernity. Because whether or not it was due to the potato, I think population growth is one of the features that we identify as, as part of the package of modernity, along with industrialization, extra-European colonization, urbanization, etc. So we could probably tell some sort of story about potatoes and population growth, and there's some kind of thing we could do there. Possibly. Maybe that's not the most compelling way I could try to make some kind of claim about potatoes and modernity, but probably you could do something in that regard. Maybe you could say something about the potatoes' journey around the world as being part of the history of modernity, because the forces that drove the potato around the world are fundamentally colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and voyages of trade and commerce. Those were the things that brought the potato from the Andes, not only to Europe, but also to India, to China, to Africa, to other parts of the world. So we could try to tell some story about how these forces of modernity were what disseminated the potato around the world. I think that would be true. But, and here I think is where the story of the potato as part of modernity maybe becomes a little bit more interesting and a little bit less kind of dutiful, but not very convincing. But everywhere that the potato landed, it embedded itself not as an object that had been introduced through violence or through invasion or through enslavement or through colonialism, but actually it embedded itself in its new homes in ways that ultimately connected it very much to the specificity and locality of its new homeland. Potatoes traveled all around the world and became associated with local ideas about national identity, about how we eat, and about foodstuffs. And so here was where my next slide was a little illustration of how potatoes are now strongly associated with national foodways everywhere from Russia. I tried to find a Russian example of a Russian salad olivier, and my non-existent Russian language skills meant that I failed to find a picture, but they're a key feature of everything from Russian salad to poutine, which some of you possibly have ever had. Yeah. So I think it's worth stressing that potatoes are cultivated in virtually every part of the world for which the UN has data. And in almost every part of the world, they are seen as absolutely local. They are the perfect immigrants. They have assimilated so successfully that almost everywhere they've gone, people have forgotten that there were not always already potatoes. A really nice example of this comes from a French traveler in the early 19th century who traveled to Colombia, and in his travel notes, he recorded ambling around a market in Bogota, in the capital city. And he said it was very interesting. There were all sorts of exotic South American vegetables that were being sold alongside European vegetables like potatoes. So potato, I mean, Bogota, which is actually pretty close to where Europeans first encountered the potato in the 16th century. It was in the highlands of Colombia. The potatoes had first been spotted by Europeans, but they were, in the eyes of Gaspar Mollien, this traveler, a familiar European staple. And so I think in a way we could consider potatoes as symbols of the ceaseless movement and reformulation of identity that characterizes the modern world. And so today, as I said, the potato is fully nationalized all around the world, and its very names tend to embed it in the locale, whether it's Jersey new potatoes, or indeed in India, there is a campaign to protect the heritage variety of potato known as Darjeeling Red Round, right, which is under threat from more recent types. Many countries, Denmark, for example, host national potato days. And in the US, for example, Idaho potatoes are protected under trademark legislation. Here you can see certified 100% Idaho potatoes, which has a legal trademark. Northern Ireland Coombe Earle potatoes also are protected under EU legislation. I think on the little bag there, you can see just about the logo of protecting them as national patrimony. There you can see a Peruvian National Day of the Potato. That makes possibly more sense, you might think, than Denmark having a National Potato Day. But the fact is you can find these things all around the world. So international regulatory structures are being used to nationalize potatoes in many different parts of the world. And so what was once foreign now lies at the heart of national identity in all these different places. And I think it's precisely this idea that inspired a pair of artists to produce this piece of street art in 1916 during the Brexit debate, right? Commenting precisely on the anti-immigration rhetoric that was rife during that period in our history. And in fact, back in the Andes themselves, Chile and Peru are locked in a struggle over competing claims to where the potato was first domesticated, and therefore who can claim right to the potato's genome under international legislation. So the potato's journey around the world, I think, is emblematic of modernity, both in the very concrete processes, colonialism, trade, that took it all around the world, but also in the ways in which the very consequences of these processes have been transmogrified into sources of national identity in many different parts of the world, and indeed in sources of pride, sources of identity and pride. So it's not just the sugar in the cup of tea, in other words, that symbolize the connections between colonialism, trade, and the modernity of our sense of identity. It's also that pile of takeaway chips, or maybe the plastic plate of poutine that some of you have had, that can represent the fundamental role that migration has played in building national culture. So I think that's the first thing I wanted to say about the connections between potatoes and modernity. But I want to move on to one other, the second and final, although I'll talk about it a bit, I think, at greater length, example that I want to give, which concerns the ways in which, over the course of the 19th century, potatoes became embedded in debates about the merits of capitalism, which I hope you will all accept as perhaps another force of modernity, or another component of our modern world, capitalism, that's to say. So I want to say what potatoes have to do with any of that. So the 19th century transformation in the nature of work and increasing industrialization generated, as I'm sure you all know, fierce debates about social justice, about poverty, about the role of the state. And at the center of all of these debates was the body of the worker. The working body was really essential to these questions about national strength. And the physical strength and resilience of the working body became the subject of enormous scientific attention during the 19th century. And I want to sketch out to you briefly the way in which potatoes, and also the everyday eating practices of ordinary people, became entangled in those debates about the working man's, usually, body and the nature of the state and the role of capitalism in changing those relationships. So the first thing to note about all of this is that from the late 18th century, European thinkers, philosophers, political economists, statesmen, etc., began to devote what I think was a totally unprecedented level of attention to the physical health of the working population. So the robustness of working people over the course of the 18th century became something that was politically important. And it was the topic of sustained debate all across Europe, because it was widely accepted that the strength and the wealth of the state was to some degree a function of the health and robustness of the population, and particularly the working population. And so that in turn required a ready and cheap supply of nourishing food. And this was something that was widely discussed over the course of the 18th century and was, considered sort of commonsensical to some extent. So as many people commented, here I'm quoting from Parmentier, a great promoter of potatoes as well, the type and choice of food greatly influences the population. So it is impossible to take too many precautions when ensuring that the people are well fed. This is not to say that Western European states accepted any responsibility necessarily for ensuring that the population was well fed. This was generally considered to be a responsibility of the individual eater, but their choices were considered to be tremendously important for the robustness of the state. So this wasn't a welfarist program necessarily, but it was something that linked the individual. It was a biopolitical program that linked the individual body of the eater to the robustness of the body politic. Now, potatoes, as it happened, were widely identified over the course of the 18th century as a particularly apt food for working bodies. And maybe this was the topic that I spoke to this seminar on years ago when I previously addressed it, possibly. I think that was probably what I was talking about. So this is all kind of this backstory for the 19th century, okay? And here, I'm now moving into the front story, not the backstory. So the backstory is this focus on the food supply and what working bodies were going to eat, and a sense that potatoes were a particularly great thing for working people to eat. Now, the potatoes' loudest advocates during the late 18th century tended to be people who happened to embrace the free market as the best method for organizing economic affairs. Not uniquely, this was a pretty widespread discourse, but they were among the loudest advocates, particularly in Western Europe. And potatoes were celebrated as ways of allowing individuals to improve their own personal health, while at the same time, almost coincidentally, improving the strength and health of the body politic. Just by looking after your own well-being and that of your family, you would become healthier and therefore would be able to contribute to the flourishing overall of the state. So it's perhaps not a coincidence that people like Adam Smith recommended potatoes as an absolutely sterling crop, as he did. So, and he made calculations that if you ate potatoes, you could nourish yourself much better. No food, he wrote, can afford a more decisive proof of its nourishing quality or of its being peculiarly suitable to the health of the human something or other organism, however that quote that ends up. So, yes, I'm just screen sharing. Thank you very much. Yes, there we are. So this intense potato promotion that was going on in the late 18th century endowed the potato with a really powerful symbolic resonance by the early 19th century. It had been insistently recommended to working people in the late 18th century as a source of personal health, of happiness. There was a whole happiness discourse associated with the potato, which I won't go into here, but which was sort of interesting, that potatoes were actually a way of kind of eating yourself happy. And the result was that they became, to some extent, I'm going to assert and then try to demonstrate, associated with the move to the market economy and to the dissolution of older models of social organization. And so people who were opposed to these changes were explicit in linking potatoes to these unwelcome developments. And nowhere is this association between potatoes and a new capitalist dispensation clearer, I think, than in the writings of William Cobbett, who is a beautiful illustration of this. He was a political activist, a farmer, a journalist. At the end of his life, he was MP for Oldham, and he campaigned for parliamentary reform, universal male suffrage, higher wages for agricultural workers. I mean, a whole series of changes that he advocated very vigorously. He was deeply concerned about the dismal situation of rural workers in England and the deterioration of rural wages, loss of access to common land, prohibitions against gleaning, a whole series of other traditional subsistent measures that were being made impossible by the move to a more capitalist form of agriculture. And he was sharply critical of all of these. And he also despised potatoes, which he closely associated with these changes. Potatoes were, in his view, the root, here I quote, of slovenliness, filth, misery, and slavery. Right? The potatoes were the root of that. And the potato-eating Irish, for Cobbett, offered a particularly terrifying vision of the future for British agricultural workers. Potatoes, Cobbett believed, kept the Irish just about barely alive so they could be exploited by landowners. And the enthusiasm that he identified among English landowners for potatoes and for encouraging potato crops, potato plots to be grown by their laborers, he saw this as a cynical attempt to, maybe I've got a quote from this, oh, there we are, to bring the Irish laborers down to the state of the Irish. That was what potatoes, that was what was behind the enthusiasm for potatoes of landowners. It would bring them down to the Irish, whose mode of living as to food is but one removed from that of the pig, and an ill-fed pig too. So he was very clear about this set of associations, and he was quite convinced that the misery and degradation of the Irish was chiefly owing to the use of potatoes as the almost sole food. And so Cobbett was very unhappy that the wholesome traditional diet of beer and bread and bacon was being replaced by potatoes and tea, which he saw as lacking any nourishment, in contrast to these 18th century promoters who saw it as a splendid food. And the promise of happiness and well-being that lay at the heart of the liberal project struck him as particularly dishonest. And so, for example, at the time of the 1834 revisions to the Poor Law, he, for example, maybe again I have a quote from this, there's another one, he condemned the new Poor Law and its promise of happiness as the impudence of all impudence. And he said that it was particularly dishonest to claim that these things would make working people more happy. So he again identified this language of happiness and well-being that lay at the heart of this model of eating potatoes, participating in a new capitalist form of economy, etc. He saw this as an impudent and dishonest claim, and the new Poor Law's true aim, as he put it, was to force working people to live off potatoes and seaweed, which is what's invisible under the. So he was, again, very clear that potatoes were associated with the move to a capitalist economy and to a immiseration of working people. I could go on about it. I mean, the only exceptions he made for potatoes, the only context in which a potato had anything to offer, as far as he was concerned, was if you used it to stuff geese. Other than that, no point at all. So Cobbett was castigating potatoes as a tool of capitalist exploitation. Liberals, in contrast, viewed it not as an enabler of market discipline, but actually as an obstacle to it. So they too associated potatoes with debates about the market, but they had a quite different vision of what the potato enabled. So advocates of liberal capitalism, of course, look forward to a bright future of rational economic practice, the sensible exchange of labor as one commodity among many others. And their objection to the potato was that it was too prolific and that it thus enabled too much autonomy from the market. you could just grow potatoes and have nothing to do with markets at all. So potatoes, in their view, facilitated precisely the sort of uneconomic behavior that they hoped to eradicate. So Cobbett and liberal thinkers thus disagreed profoundly about whether potatoes enabled or impeded the spread of market relations, but they all agreed that Ireland was the clearest illustration of their point of view, right? So we've seen Cobbett citing Ireland as the dismal future that was awaiting English agricultural workers if landlords had their way. And for liberal writers as well, Ireland illustrated precisely what was wrong with potatoes, which was that they were a backward crop that prevented a modern economic system from emerging. Now, during the 18th century, Ireland had often been heralded as the premier example of the potato's beneficent population building properties. So there were many writers in the 18th century who said, if you have any doubts that the potato is a particularly nourishing food, very suitable for working bodies, all you need to do is look at Ireland. Look at all the crowds of people living in these, Irish peasant huts. Look how healthy they are. There's so many of them, and they're just living on potatoes. That's I rest my case. So this, and indeed the very fact that potatoes were seen as protecting the people who grew them from market variations was also celebrated in the 18th century as a fine thing. So people like Arthur Young said, just look at Ireland, the people who grow potatoes, they have nothing to do with markets. They depend not on markets. And that makes them much better off than anyone else. Well, by the 1820s, the potato's capacity to sustain families independent of market conditions began to look much less attractive to some observers. And as Britain's economy moved from a fundamentally agrarian model to one that was heading towards a more industrial capitalist framework, what was required to facilitate this was seen not as a large population of hearty, self-sustaining workers, but what you needed was a smoothly functioning economic system, right? Not just lots of hearty peasants. And the market, so it didn't just depend on people. It required a particular organization, as I said, around particular forms of waged labor and relations between employers and workforces, and the dominance of the market in setting prices and wages. And so potatoes, in that view, were, as the literary critic David Lloyd put it, I think, really beautifully. He said, potatoes became associated with moral and political, as well as economic characteristics that were recalcitrant to capitalist developments. They were a scandalous, potatoes were, and potentially destabilizing alternative to the economic and political forms that the reproduction of capital requires. So the potato was a sort of, a scandalous alternative. And the writings of Malthus are a splendid barometer of this change. Unsurprisingly, Malthus was not enthusiastic about potatoes, right? Adam Smith, as I said, was, right? For the reasons that I sketched out, it made sense that he should like potatoes, and indeed he did. And if potatoes lead to splendid population growth, you can imagine that Malthus would be very unenthusiastic about potatoes, and so he was. So he believed that an increase in the Irish population enabled by potatoes was going to find its natural limit, and that this abundant supply of food was going to head in only one direction, and that was going to be a tremendous humanitarian catastrophe, which from 1803 or so he was predicting. And he would be, when the potato crop failed, which he thought was inevitable, the circumstances would be, as he put it, beyond all comparison dreadful. And the terrible events of the famines of the 1840s in Ireland proved to his satisfaction that a situation that, in fact, the British government had played a substantial role in bringing about was, in fact, the result of the backward and uneconomic attitudes of Irish peasants themselves. And like Cobbett, Malthus associated the potato with degradation. He blamed the potato, along with the ignorance and barbarism of the people in Ireland, along with their squalid living conditions and their inadequate clothing and their poor hygiene. He blamed this package of things for maintaining the Irish population in the miserable and depressed state in which he believed they existed. And he said if the same system were to extend to England, the rags and wretched cabins of Ireland would follow. So just as Cobbett had predicted, right, but in a different, from a different political economic framework. So an increase in potato consumption and the spread of potato grounds across England, he said, would be a most cruel and fatal blow to the happiness. Again, we see the references to happiness of the lower classes of this country, the worst that they had ever experienced. There we are. So in various essays, he dissected what he referred to as the radical evil of potatoes. And he linked, as I said, their widespread consumption to the immiseration of Irish laborers. And so, I mean, I think it's, it's not just that it led to population growth, which was going to then lead at some point to a population collapse, but the fact that it was kept you alive, but it didn't provide you with a marketable commodity, as Malthus saw it, meant that rural workers weren't able to purchase any of the other goods that they needed to live a commodious life. They weren't able to enter into a state of comfort that they could have acquired through market exchange and through acquiring goods and commodities. So potatoes for Malthus were bad for the Irish, and they set a really ominous precedent for people in other countries. Nothing good could possibly come of their consumption from his point of view. And so Malthus and his allies in government were explicit about what they saw as the beneficial consequences that resulted from the famine or famines that spread, over the 1840s. So the total destruction of the Irish rural economy offered to them, as they saw it, a golden opportunity to introduce proper capitalism into Ireland. And how? Asked the chief officer of the Treasury in London, Charles Trevelyan, whose writings on the famine have been widely studied. How, he asked, were Irish laborers going to support themselves in the future after the famine, after the collapse of the rural potato economy? Well, he saw only one possibility. I think maybe I put this on a slide. Here we are. He said the position occupied by these classes is no longer tenable, and it is necessary for them to live by the wages of their labor. But instead of eating homegrown potatoes, they were going to eat grain, which they will purchase out of their wages. They will continue to live from agriculture, but agriculture conducted according to, let's see again if I can find where the tail end of my quote goes. Thank you very much. According to a new and very improved condition, right? So in other words, the Irish are going to become a rural proletariat. And they would continue to live from agriculture, but in this very improved way. So the famine for Trevelyan and many other politicians at the time provided what one MP described as a glorious opportunity to transform Ireland away from a society of autarkic potato eaters to one in which the Irish consumed a higher kind of food, as they commented at the time, and developed the necessary, quote, habits of industry and improvement that would allow them to purchase that food. So the potato famine, viewed from the perspective of Whitehall, in a way, was something that usefully obliged the able-bodied Irish to join the rural proletariat. And the potato, in contrast, had enabled and represented their previous failure to enter the modern world. So I think we've got two quite different visions of what the potato did, both of them connected to these debates about the nature of capitalism and the capitalist transformation. Let me just give you a few, one or two more examples of this, and then I'll try to wind this up. So the dismal effect of Ireland's reliance on potatoes and its existing system of land tenure was expressed, I think, with equal clarity by the Scottish economist John Ramsay MacCulloch, who was, of course, a disciple also of Malthus and a friend of and fellow economist of people like David Ricardo. And in MacCulloch's analysis of Ireland, he argued that the tiny plots of land onto which Irish laborers had been squeezed, but which they could just about sustain themselves off because they were growing this overly prolific potatoes. He argued that the effect of all of this was to stifle any spirit of industry or self-improvement, or rather, as Malthus had argued. And he wrote, McCulloch wrote that, and there's an interesting quote that I want us to look at. Oh, come on. He argued that lacking any kind of stimulating contact with the outside world, these stagnant rural laborers, as he put it, sink into a state of apathy and of sluggish and stupid indifference. And isolation and ignorance then impeded the formation of the arts. It prevented the rural population even from recognizing their own immiserated condition. And consequently, as he wrote here, they cannot act collectively and must therefore submit themselves with less resistance to the yoke of the oppressor. So the autonomy enabled by potatoes, so celebrated by people like Arthur Young in the 18th century, turned out to be no autonomy at all. It merely made you easy prey for the yoke of the oppressor. So, well, if I want to talk about debates about capitalism in the 19th century in Western Europe, it would perhaps be natural that I would want to turn to capitalism's greatest theorist, Marx, who was, of course, writing in London in the 1850s. And he drew on these very notions when he compared the politically inert French peasantry to potatoes in a sack. The French nation, as he stressed in the 18th Brumaire, consisted of little more, he wrote, than a disparate, disconnected mass of isolated peasant families, much like the aggregation of a lot of potatoes in a sack constituted a sack of potatoes, but neither had any larger collective identity. And like McCulloch, who believed that isolation created a system which made it impossible for Irish courtiers to act collectively, and that they therefore must submit themselves with less resistance to the yoke of the oppressor, Marx maintained that the autarkic existence of these peasant smallholders in France isolated them one from another and also from the modern world. And as he wrote, they are unable to assert their own class interests in their own name, be it by a parliament or by convention. They cannot represent one another. They must themselves be represented. Right? I think you can see some similarities with that in the way that McCulloch was framing the effect of potatoes on the Irish. So both the French peasant and the Irish potato-eating peasant were prey to demagogues and tyrants because of their isolation, which had to do with their separation from the modern world. So it's little wonder, I think, that the metaphor that Marx selected to describe the state of isolation from the modern world was the potato. I hope you can see that this wasn't it wasn't just by chance that he picked the potato as his marker. So I want to try to pull this all together into some kind of conclusion. So over the course of the 19th century, potatoes came to represent, I've been trying to suggest, some essential features of the new economic structures that were reshaping Western Europe. And indeed, Marx scarcely needed to travel to London to absorb this image of the potato as an emblem of isolation from modern capitalism, or as an impediment to progress, whether that progress was seen as a sort of Marxian formation of class consciousness or integration into a world of consumerism. However you might have seen modernity in this period, you didn't need to come to the British Isles to see the potato as being part of that debate. This was in fact a debate that was characterized by, in many different Western European countries. I will just give you one little example from this French physician who commented in the 1870s, what progress can one expect from a people who are content to eat potatoes? So what I've tried to suggest here is that thinking about potatoes can in fact perhaps help us think about how the everyday eating habits of ordinary people became embedded in some of the most fundamental debates about the nature of economic and political life in 19th century Europe, debates which in fact lay at the center or the heart of modernity itself. So to try to conclude, maybe potatoes are not such a bad emblem of modernity after all. Their global presence is a function of some of the important forces shaping the modern world: colonialism, transatlantic and global slave trades, increasing globalization and global trade. It's nationalization as heritage foods all over the world in regions far from its original homeland perhaps illustrate the powerful ability of nationalism to transform daily life into political culture. And finally, I've tried to suggest that potatoes offered 19th century Europeans a way of crystallizing the enormous changes that were wrought by modernity into a single pithy emblem of capitalism itself. And that in everyday foodstuff should be able to do this. Perhaps actually shouldn't surprise us, really, after all, since perhaps the most fundamental feature of modernity is the way that it inscribes itself into and onto our very bodies, linking us in chains of consumption to people and things all over the world. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for listening.